In past videos, I have mentioned briefly such terms as introverted perceiving and extroverted judging. In this video, I would like to expand on these concepts because I found them really useful for understanding the nature of the functions and how they tend to manifest in consciousness. So let me first review some of the terms before I begin building on them. I am working with that approach to extroversion and introversion, which focuses on the subjective abstraction of introversion and the objective affirmation of extroversion that I went over in the previous video. So I am also working with my usual conception of perceiving and judging, namely that perception refers to the pure observation, reception, and processing of information without forming any definite conclusions or criteria about them, whilst judgment is very much concerned with developing such conclusions and criteria concerning the world and organizing the world accordingly. If we take these two definitions, we can put them together and get first extroverted perception, which refers to affirming objective perceptions of the world. So for that, I like to use the word awareness. It is not, however, just a pure sensory awareness. Everybody has that. Rather, it is a productive awareness that not only senses the environment but interprets it and understands it and enjoys it, or at least attempts to. It is a cognitive awareness rather than a merely sensory awareness. It can translate as a cultural awareness or social awareness. This entails not only immediate awareness without memory or anticipation, but a potentially exceptional memory and anticipation of future events and such. Dominant extroverted sensation type, for instance, while they most certainly value the richness of the immediate moment, are by no means trapped in the immediate moment. That's something people tend to get confused about. They are very capable of drawing from their experiences in the past to become very capable and knowledgeable about the world in the present. This is often more readily admitted about extroverted intuitive types than extroverted sensation types, but it's the exact same principle. If an NE type can be described as experienced and having seen a lot in their time, then you can bet that SE types are exactly the same way, only with their view set on what actually happened photographically, rather than on general connections between things that happen. Also, remember that we all experience this side of ourselves, this active awareness of the environment. The only question is to what degree it is preferred, which is defined by the theoretical function stack, and whether it is sensing or intuitive. An INTP, for instance, exercises auxiliary extroverted perception in the intuitive form, while an INFJ exercises inferior extroverted perception in the sensing form. This difference, once understood, reveals a very definite difference of flavor between INFJs and INTPs that can potentially help you to distinguish between them. The INTP has an intuitive awareness of their external environment, which prompts this certain restlessness at times and a willingness and need to travel and explore and always have something externally new. The INFJ, however, repressing this aspect of themselves, is much more willing to become a homebody and remain perfectly content to sink into their own thoughts and be completely satisfied that way because they don't feel this need to experience the highest pitch of actuality. On that note, we can begin describing the direct functional opposite of extroverted perception, which is introverted perception. This can be described as abstracting from perceptions of the world. Here, I like to use the word wisdom, not because this makes a person wiser than extroverted perception would, but as a way to denote its more recording nature. Extroverted perception is aware because of its objective, unconcerned attitude. It's aware of things happening outside of itself, and they remain that way separate from the observer. To be aware of something implies this definite distinction between the observer and the things observed and whatever they're bringing to bear on that situation. Wisdom, however, implies a more blurred relationship between the subject and the object, precisely because introverted perception understands the world by relating it to its subjective ideas and seeing it through that lens. It is not aware of the world in an unbiased reporting fashion of extroverted perception. It is aware of it in the form of wisdom abstracted from experience and interpreted as ideal memories or ideas that represent a host of past experiences. It is aware not of the world, but of its interconnected subjective interpretation of the world. Hence, the term wisdom, denoting the importance of the interpreting subject over the importance of the impressing object. So, whilst extroverted perception perceives events in the world as separate and distinct in their meaning, like a bunch of points on a scatter plot, with any connections being drawn between these events are only for one's convenience and can be just as easily deconstructed and reconstructed between each of these points, introverted perception perceives events in the world as necessarily interconnected, being mere instances of a bigger issue represented by the subject's worldview, and inextricable from this whole explanation. So it's not so much the scatter plot, but let me give another example. Extroverted perception operates more like someone playing with Legos to see all of the different possible combinations. So each Lego piece is separate from all of the other Lego pieces. It's an atom, if you will, that can be combined and recombined infinitely with all the other Legos. Introverted perception, however, is like a ball of clay that the Legos are pressed into to form a sculpture. The sculpture gets a very different and revealing perspective on the Legos and how they could fit together, but it is also far harder for it to get multiple perspectives on the same Lego piece, and it is much more difficult to modify the sculpture, with each impression building and modifying on all the others in a way that if you were to try to change it, it would mess everything up. Introverted perceiving intermixes and inextricably relates information in ways that both reveal things that could not be understood otherwise, but also necessarily warps information. There are, of course, two kinds of introverted perceiving, sensing and intuitive. The difference here is the same as with extroverted perception. The one develops wisdom concerning the actual world, and the other develops wisdom concerning the possible imaginative world. A useful contrast here might be between Freud and Jung. Freud's wisdom was both based on and revolved around things themselves, often the countless dreams, experiences, and emotions of his patients, which he stuck to in his development of all his theories. He always referred back to those. Though one can argue that he clearly interpreted these individual experiences heavily to obtain a better understanding of the overarching form of the experience. Jung, however, always tended to enter much more speculative territory more freely, making far grander associations between things, branching off into different subjects in ways that Freud never did. Freud was much more scientific in the sense that he limited the scope of his claims to the data he felt he had recorded. Jung was far more speculative in the sense that his constant desire was to associate more and more things together from a small amount of data, to see how far the ideas could stretch over everything before they began falling apart. Though both heavily interpreted data through synthetic Platonic patterns and thus came up with very fascinating insights, Freud's syntheses were always focused on things themselves and retained a definite sense of scientific grounding, while Jung's syntheses always tended towards more and more associations apart from what was actually there and retained a definite sense of philosophical and mystical exploration and discovery. Now for the rational functions, or the judgment functions. We can say that extraverted judgment is affirming objective criteria for its judgments, or in somewhat less abstract terms, relying on the facts to form judgments. So I say facts to denote objectively verifiable propositions about the world, statements that can always trace their justification back to some objective event. For example, Aristotle's metaphysics, which rests on man's ability through nous, or mind, to synthesize objectively gathered information into inductive principles. Thus, Aristotle insists that the principles upon which we build any science or study be derived entirely from observable phenomenon or facts. Another good example is Ayn Rand's objectivist ethics, which emphasizes how what man is determines what he ought to do, for only what man is objectively verifiable. Those are, of course, both examples of extroverted thinking, but what about extroverted feeling? As Jung points out, we are not accustomed to speaking of feelings or value judgments as objective. We think of those as subjective, much less to base our value judgments on facts in the regular sense. However, and once again, I am simply using the term fact to denote an objectively verifiable proposition, regardless of what the proposition is about. Extroverted thinking facts concern raw mechanics of the world, if you want to put it that way. Extroverted feeling facts, on the other hand, concern the observable values and feelings in the world, i.e., what is considered valuable, normal, comforting, or desirable by a person or culture. Extroverted feeling then works to accommodate these objective feelings. It draws people's feelings out and examines them. It treats them with all the objectivity reputed in extroverted thinking, but rather than focusing on the mechanics, it focuses on what you could call the feeling atmosphere of something. Extroverted feeling is essentially a translator function. It is not lying or being insincere any more than a good translator or any communicator is being insincere by altering words in order to communicate their ideas more truthfully to the audience, to get it across to them. Extroverted feeling often feels that in order for it to tell the truth, it must carefully tailor what it says for different groups or individuals so that it reaches them the way that it is intended. The important thing to remember, however, is this concept of objective verification. Any theory or judgment propounded by TE or FE will be based and traceable to some mechanical fact or cultural fact, respectively. This mindset is often particularly alien to the opposing attitude, introverted judgment, which works completely backwards from, you could say, subjectively verifiable, that is, not objectively verifiable at all, ideas down to objective facts. So, in other words, introverted judgment begins with certain a priori or before experience principles which it takes to be undeniable or self-evident and from which everything else can be deduced or accounted for. For example, Descartes' I think therefore I am, or Rousseau's I feel therefore I am. That's not an actual quote, but that's a good way to consolidate it. I feel, therefore I am. Coincidentally, these two statements can also sum up the natures of TI and FI, respectively. Now, introverted judgment, we could say, is abstracting and forming subjective criteria for its judgments, or in somewhat less abstract terms, relying on principles to form judgments rather than facts. Now I say principles to denote subjectively verifiable propositions about the world, statements that can always trace their justification back to some pure idea conceptualized by the subject as a better representation of reality than any given data from reality itself. As Jung describes when contrasting extroverted thinking with introverted thinking, the advantage of extroverted thinking is its ability to accurately apprehend and construct things from the objective data presented. But the advantage of introverted thinking is its immunity to the possibility of conditions being locally abnormal or data being inaccurately presented to it, because for introverted thinking, it's the abstract, subjective principle that always supersedes the current local data. In fact, introverted thinking is ultimately trying to develop an abstract principle which can account as much as possible for the objective data. So, as I've described in previous videos, a major theme here is where the subject assumes reliability to be. Introverted thinking and introverted feeling both perceive their own personal theoretical workshops to be where reliable and stable ideas can be produced. While the outside world is always changing, it's always hiding itself, it's never presenting itself accurately, but is only ascertainable through the processes of pure reason. Extroverted thinking and extroverted feeling, of course, see things the opposite way, with the internal world being unreliable, arbitrary, changing, vague, foggy, biased, and so forth, and reliability is always resting in the tangible facts of the world. Now, I've talked a lot about introverted thinking, where the principle is, you could say, thought. What about the elusive function introverted feeling? Introverted feeling, as Jung says, is essentially the same as introverted thinking in all respects, except that its principles are felt. This, of course, does not mean emotionally felt, but felt in the sense that I've associated with value judgments, as well as the related ideas of sentiment, feeling tones, atmosphere, and so on. This is why I often have associated introverted feeling with passion and sincerity, because it adheres to principles which are composed of values and feeling tones and sentiment. Those are the best words I can come up with. Introverted feeling is what we normally associate with feelings and values in general. Extroverted feeling is actually kind of the weird one. Introverted feeling is the one we're more used to. Introverted feeling is often easily recognizable to us in art. At least in my opinion, many musicians, artists, filmmakers, writers have demonstrated introverted feeling, and that they are expressing their rational feelings for something in the form of a principle isolated from the specific facts, a feeling principle. It feels despite the world around it, whereas introverted thinking thinks despite the world around it. The difference could be expressed this way between Bertrand Russell and D.H. Lawrence, who apparently had arguments over a course of letters in which Russell would talk about the raw logic governing human relationships, and D.H. Lawrence would talk about the principles of loneliness and love and our deepest motivations towards each other. So notice that both of them are talking about the exact same thing, but in different ways that are strangely completely incongruent with each other. Russell believes that the logic of the relationship causes those involved to feel certain ways. So-and-so feels bad because he's lonely, and loneliness is defined as isolation from other people, and we don't like loneliness because we are defined as social creatures, and so on. Lawrence, however, believes that it's the sentimental drives and motivations that cause relationships to take on certain logical forms. So-and-so marries what's-her-name because he is feeling lonely, and he's feeling lonely because he feels the natural pull to love another person and thus escape the cold darkness of loneliness itself, and so on. Russell is focused on the mechanics involved, Lawrence is focused on the feelings, and both feel that their focus is the true bottom line, the true a priori principle. So, I hope that this was a useful video to you, and be sure to let me know any questions that you have in the comments below, or any comments or criticisms in the comments section below, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.